Well, welcome everyone to our second coffee break chat. We are excited to have so many people on here. It's wonderful also to see so many familiar faces and names out there, especially for preservationists. You know, the fact that we haven't seen each other or bumped into each other in person in the last 2 weeks is rather crazy when you think about what life is normally like for preservationists. But it's fantastic to see everyone here. And I just wanted, Francis and I are really looking forward to this, but I wanted to take a moment and unmute some special guests we have here. And that's Otis Pratt Pearsall and Nancy Pearsall. How are you doing today?
We are doing splendidly well. Can you hear us?
Yes.
You've got Curly in the background.
Very nice. Well, I hope, Otis, at some point here as we get into the conversation, Francis and I will unmute you again and perhaps get some insights from you, seeing as you were one of the people who was truly there with Henry Hope Reed.
Well, Nancy was truly there, and I've dug out of my splendid file a note from Henry Hope Reed addressing Nancy's involvement in the preparation of his walking tour for Brooklyn Heights in September '61.
Fantastic. All right. Well, Nancy, we are looking forward to hearing more about that in one or 2 minutes. All right. Well, first things first, my name is Brad Vogel, and I am the executive director of the New York Preservation Archive Project. And we're an organization that is designed to look at the history of the preservation movement in New York City. And why are we focused on the history of the preservation movement? First and foremost, we want to make sure that the efforts of historic preservationists are remembered, that they matter, that people do not forget why some of our great buildings and neighborhoods continue to exist today despite all the many obstacles to their enduring in the city. The other part is to inspire. And I think if you review our website, and I have it up in the chat, or actually I'll put it up right now, it's just NYPAP.org. And if you take a look there, you will see all sorts of different oral histories and preservation database entries that help to round out and make whole this story of all the efforts of people over the decades to try to save some of the best things about New York City. So take a look sometime. But our Coffee Break Chat series is designed to give you a little bit of a special look, something different that provides color and insight on some of the figures and fights that made up preservation in New York City. Now today's focus is especially fitting because we are in the 55th anniversary month of the New York City Landmarks Law. And the figure we're focused on today, Henry Hope Reed, was deeply involved in some of those early times in those years, especially between the BARD Act, which gets passed at the state level in 1956, which then allows New York City in 1965 to finally implement its own New York City Landmarks Law. So he's churning and moving at a pivotal time in the history of the preservation movement here. But we have a special guest today, someone who actually worked with Henry Hope Reed and collaborated with him on various projects. And I think we'll have some extra special insight as a result. And that is Francis Morrone, someone that many of you know. So Francis, welcome and thank you for joining us. Looks like things are going well in the Rose reading room today for you.
This is where I was when the shelter-in-place order came down, and they wouldn't let me out. So
a likely story.
I've been here for 48 days.
Very nice. All right, well, just a bit of background for all of you. If you don't know Francis, Francis is an architectural historian and writer, the author of 12 books, including Guide to New York City Urban Landscapes, and with Henry Hope Reed, the New York Public Library, the architecture and decoration of the Stephen A. Schwarzman Building. Even more apropos now that we are into the bio. He's also written architectural guidebooks for both Philadelphia and Brooklyn, and his History of the East Village and its Architecture was published by the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation through a grant from the Preservation League in 2018. He has curated numerous exhibitions at eminent institutions around the city, and he's the recipient of the Arthur Ross Award from the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, the Landmarks Lion Award from HDC, and the New York and NYU's Excellence in Teaching Award. And he was named by Travel and Leisure magazine as one of the 13 best tour guides in the world. So just remember that as we get into this, we are dealing with someone who has some very granular knowledge about what he's talking about. And interestingly, he not only focuses on classical architecture and public sculpture, but he's also an expert on Edith Wharton and Willa Cather. And he served as an architecture critic for the New York Sun for 6 years, and he was scheduled, when the lockdown hit, to be giving a keynote lecture at the Edith Wharton Society conference in June of this year, but alas, that has been canceled. But thankfully, our conversation today is very much going forward. And with that, I would like to start off, Francis, with a very simple question to you. What was Henry Hope Reed like as a person?
Well, Henry was a very serious man, and he took architecture very seriously. He also was, I think, a word which is often used about him, but it's a tricky word because it can imply certain things that are not necessarily attractive, and that word is curmudgeonly. I really don't like that word. I use it to describe myself, but I think what it means is that he didn't suffer fools, at least by his lights. Henry had certain expressions that he would use, such as most sort of famously, hopeless modernist. But just as often, he would use the phrase mere realist. Augustus St. Gaudens was a mere realist. And when Henry said these things, it was almost like he had this sort of gravitas. It sounded like the judgment of God. And it was when you were with him, you did not argue the point. You didn't say, well, he wasn't just a mere realist. You just didn't do that. It was very difficult because he had a certain presence, but what made him so wonderful, what drew me to him, the magnetism that he had for me and for so many others, was that his head was full of material, of information, of insight. The thing about Henry was whenever he spoke about the great architects of New York or of America, it always seemed like he knew them. When he spoke about a certain building, he made it sound like he was there when it was being built, when he couldn't possibly have been because it was built 25 years before he was born. Nonetheless, he had a way of speaking about buildings in that way that is unlike the way anybody else I've ever heard speak about buildings speak.
Okay. Now, to your knowledge, was that based on his extensive research into archives and the like, or was this based on personal connections with people who had served as draftsmen or as architects who knew the original architects?
All of the above. He actually knew people who had personal connections with the great architects of the Beaux-Arts generation. And when it came to archives, he not only worked with archives himself, but he, more than anyone I know, discovered archives. He was responsible for finding architects' papers and documents, and then getting those architects' families to donate them to the New York Historical Society or to Avery Library.
Right.
So much of what we all deal with on a regular basis is only there because of Henry.
Okay. Now, would you say that Henry's focus, because he's known, there are all these very colorful phrases that get used when we're talking about Henry in the literature. Would you say that he was more an ardent foe of modern architecture, or more sort of the chief exponent of classicism? Did he lean to one side or another? He was pro-classical architecture or anti-modernism, or was it all of one piece?
Well, it was all of one piece. He was a great believer in the timeless virtues of classical architecture, and he could never understand why it had been rejected in the way that it had been rejected as a means of contemporary practice. Um, was he an ardent foe of modernism? God, yes, he was, and it was. And it was, sometimes a little difficult for those among his acolytes who didn't share quite that degree of loathing of modernist architecture. But yes, he absolutely hated it. And I should point out that in his earliest years as dealing with architecture, he wasn't that way. Um, and he sort of followed a path that a handful of young architectural people in the late 1940s and early 1950s followed. For example, Henry's celebrated collaborator in the 1950s, with whom Henry wrote a couple of books, excellent books, by the way, was a man named Christopher Tunnard. A name that will be familiar to some of you, but perhaps not to most of you. Christopher Tunnard was, if you were to look him up, you'd find he was one of the most celebrated modernist landscape architects of the 20th century. Indeed, he holds an honored place in the history of modernism in landscape architecture. But by the time Christopher went to teach urban planning at Yale, he and invited Henry to join him at Yale in the early 1950s. Tunnard had sort of rejected his modernist past. And Henry was sort of the same way. Henry went to Harvard at the very time that Joseph Hudnut was dean of the Graduate School of Design and recruited Walter Gropius to teach there. And when Henry first traveled around Europe to look at buildings and to build up his knowledge of architecture, whom do you think he traveled with? Paul Rudolph. Henry, I'm sorry. No, so Henry actually followed a path, and there were others who followed that same path at the time. People like John Barrington Bailey and Wayne Andrews, who were very close friends of Henry. They were all sort of developing their taste and their ideas and building up their knowledge at the same time. Very exciting.
Yeah, no, Francis, that's fascinating stuff. I mean, one thing that I want to jump to, because I know it's in so many people's minds right now, is what about the walking tours? Basically, from what I understand, Henry Hope Reed is essentially the grandfather of the architectural walking tour in New York City.
Well, he was, indeed. There are no two ways about it. Henry did not invent the walking tour. There had always been walking tours of one sort or other in New York. There had always been very touristy walking tours. You'll read, for example, how in the mid-19th century, people took out-of-town visitors on walking tours of the 5 points. So there had always been walking tours. And there was also, of course, the great European tradition of tours. There is that figure whom we call the cicerone in Italy, who would lead people who were on the grand tour on walking tours around Rome or Florence, showing them the buildings or the paintings in the museum. These were an inspiration to Henry in the 1950s when he was working with the Municipal Art Society. And a lot of people there, including the great Albert Bard, were trying to come up with ways to educate the public and get out the word about preservation. This in the years leading up to the Landmarks Law of 1965. It was Henry who had the idea that walking tours would be not only a great tool for this, but the principal tool for this. And so MAS signed on and said, yes, if you show that slide, and maybe go to full screen, Brad. This is a remarkable, well, there's Henry. Yeah, right here, this one. Neither snow, slush, nor curious keep art unit hikers from appointed rounds. This shows you where walking tours were at the time. They were such a novelty, at least this kind of walking tour was such a novelty that the New York Times sent a reporter along. And it wasn't only John Sibley at the New York Times who did this. Brendan Gill in the New Yorker wrote about Henry's early walking tours and wrote about them as though they were this new marvel. Henry's first walking tour, a tour that, by the way, I recreate every April on the tours, on or near the tour's anniversary, which is April 8th. This was of Madison Square. Today, Madison Square is, of course, one of the most popular parts of New York. A young New Yorker of today simply can't believe that there was a time when Madison Square was a backwater, and that in 1956, when Henry took an MAS group round Madison Square, everything that they were seeing was brand new to them. Stuff that they had never really looked at, never really thought about. And when Henry showed them buildings like the Appellate Courthouse or the Farragut Monument in Madison Square, these things were brand new to people. Something that isn't often mentioned, but that I happen to know because Henry told me, is that his real inspiration was a book that he loved. One of his most beloved books was something called Walks in Rome by a man named Augustus Hare, H-A-R-E. Some of you may be familiar with that book. Most of you probably not. It was a Victorian guidebook to Rome, an immensely detailed guidebook to Rome, a book that Henry himself used to acquaint himself with Rome. And when he started leading these MAS walking tours, that was his model. He sort of used an Augustus Hare model for talking about buildings and leading people around. And these were a sensation. The first MAS walking tour, more than 100 people signed up for it. It was a horrible, rainy day, just a miserable day, as fate would have it. And yet, most of the people showed up, and most of the people stayed till the very end. Walking tours are today such a common thing in New York that if it's a miserable day, people bow out early or they don't show up at all. But back then, it was enough of a novelty that people braved it and stayed till the very end.
Okay, I apologize. I have some background noise here, but I just wanted to say I'm going to unmute Nancy and Otis now. So if Nancy, you want to share some of your insights from your interactions with Henry Hope Reed and some of those early walking tours, that would be fantastic.
Oh, well, thank you. Let me defer to Otis, who's been reviewing the file.
I love files. I adore files. And
I was about to say, when is Otis not reviewing a file?
Well, Henry Hope Reed played a giant role in the Brooklyn Heights story because it was he who put me on to Clay Lancaster, who was the godfather of architectural history in Brooklyn Heights and wrote the book Old Brooklyn Heights, New York's first suburb. But I had a cousin who was keeping company with I think you could call her an architectural historian after a fashion, Maud Dilliard. And Maud Dilliard did a book on the old Dutch houses of Brooklyn. And she was a pal of Henry Hope Reed's. And when we were looking around we wondered how we would be able to establish evidence that we were entitled in Brooklyn Heights to historic district status. Maud introduced us to Henry Hope Reed, and that started a whole relationship that lasted throughout that entire period. Eventually, Clay, of course, wrote his book, Old Brooklyn Heights, New York's first suburb, and it was published in October of '61. And in September of '61, Henry Hope Reed was preparing his walking tour for Brooklyn Heights, which has a prelude to it that gives Clay credit for most of the facts. And Nancy was sort of the go-between between Clay and Henry Hope Reed, providing Henry Hope Reed with some kind of a proof. I've forgotten exactly whether it was a galley proof or whether it was a page proof. But anyway, it was from that proof that Henry Hope Reed prepared this. I actually can show you. Here it is. The actual first edition of the walking tour for Brooklyn Heights.
Fantastic.
And, in the beginning, he says, this tour has been made possible by the kind assistance of Mr. Clay Lancaster. It's based on his forthcoming book, The Streets of Brooklyn Heights and Their Century-Old Houses. Well, of course, that was not at all the title, but whatever it was that Nancy gave him didn't really have the title. Those who desire to obtain the volume are advised to write to Mr. Lancaster at 30 Monroe Place. And so this particular copy came from Henry Hope Reed and has a little note on it. It says, Dear Nancy, sorry about the missing pages in the brochures. Well, he had previously sent an earlier copy of the tour guide that was missing a page or so. Enclosed are several copies with all the pages, all underscored. Most of the facts are from Clay's book, as you can tell. I was sorry. I was sorry that the title is wrong, but I think it really makes little difference. Be sure to see that the book, he's talking about the book, is sold through the museum. Then he kindly remembers me. Please remember me to Otis. Sincerely, Henry Hope Reed Jr. A little bit of the actual history. That's the beginning of the Brooklyn Heights walking tour.
That's fantastic, Otis. And thank you, you and Nancy, for sharing that. I mean, just to situate our audience here, we all have to remember that this is happening in Brooklyn Heights in the 1950s, well before there is even a New York City landmarks law. And yet Otis, Nancy, Henry Hope Reed, and others, Municipal Art Society, Clay Lancaster, are all pushing for a historic district in Brooklyn Heights before there is a law to do such a thing. So just incredible that we have you here to tell this story today. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
One other thing, and I know that Francis mentioned Albert Bard earlier. So when the Municipal Art Society sort of connected with you through Henry Hope Reed, there was a small subcommittee put together, if I read your oral history with NYPAP correctly. And on that committee were some rather august names. You had people like Albert Bard, Henry Hope Reed, and Alan Burnham, if I'm not mistaken.
That was the whole committee.
So
That was it. Um,
Oh, it wasn't numbered.
and what an amazing group of people that was. These are the, this is, and what an exciting time that was, because all of this was new. There was a sense of discovery that must have been just unbelievably exciting. I know that when I sort of got into this game for the first time, I'm old enough, just old enough, not as old as Otis, but just old enough.
Almost nobody is.
What's that? That when I got into this game, there were still discoveries to be made, and that quickened the pulse in a way that doesn't quite happen anymore in 2020, because we've sort of been doing this for a long time. We've been, we have the graduate programs in historic preservation and so on now that didn't at all exist back then. But the people who were the sort of leaders of this at the time, people like Henry, these were just not just important civic men, but they were enormously cultured people. Their desire to see buildings in New York City preserved was sort of part of their larger vision of what it meant for there to be such a thing as American culture. These men were erudite. They could talk to you about art. They could talk to you about literature. They could speak to you in French. They, were just amazing individuals, and they had a kind of zeal about what they were doing that was almost messianic.
right. So one thing on that note, Francis, I have a copy here, and I'll maybe take myself off my virtual background so people can see it better. But this is a book called The Golden City, and it helps to encapsulate some of the views of Henry Hope Reed. Did you want to talk a bit about that and how that played into his overall view?
Yeah, well, in the 1950s, Henry was growing sort of more and more chagrined about the path that modernist architecture was taking. He wrote a piece in Perspecta, the Yale architecture magazine, in which he suggested that modernism on the Bauhaus line was not a fait accompli. And he sort of followed this up with some other writings, particularly The Golden City, his book, which came out in 1959. In which he discussed the genealogy of modernism, discussed some of the things that he thought were particularly wrong with modernism, and also borrowed a kind of rhetorical trick from Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin's book Contrasts of 1836. Henry would juxtapose images of classical or traditional architecture with modernist architecture in such a way that anybody leafing through the pages would think, oh my God, this classical stuff is so much better. The book was kind of a take no prisoners approach to the subject. It was deeply alienating to some people, and yet the book was also deeply enlightening to others. I sent to you, Brad, and I don't know if it's possible to put it up on the screen, but a letter that Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis wrote to Henry after she read Golden City. To her, this was this was actually not after she this was after she had seen a Palladio exhibition at the Cooper Hewitt Museum in 1977. And she wrote to Henry, "Dear Mr. Reed, I've just returned from the Palladio exhibition, which was more marvelous than I could have imagined. Then I bought your book, The Golden City, and came home and read it as I progressed." I have always felt slightly ashamed of feeling that way, feeling that there was something lacking in modern architecture, that there must be something wrong with me to not appreciate the architecture of my time. As I read your book, I saw all my rebellious thoughts confirmed. It was like finding a long-sought friend or mentor. That is why I bolted from my chair to write to you. How I wish I had been on your walking tours. I so hope I can go on one with you next winter. Well, how would you like it if you went on a walking tour and one of your fellow tour goers was Mrs. Onassis? But I don't think she ever did. Nonetheless, the feeling was there. He got a very similar letter, and this is not a well-known fact. He got a very similar letter, which I don't have to share with you, from Jane Jacobs, who, after reading The Golden City, said to Henry that she had erred in writing The Death and Life of Great American Cities in not making some of the points that Henry had made in The Golden City, because she said that she had come to realize that classical or traditional architecture was a very, very important part of the story that she was trying to tell, and had not done so. So Henry struck a chord in the hearts and minds of certain people at that time with this book. But as I say, the book isn't going to please everyone who reads it. I would suggest, however, that you just try to set aside your prejudices, as I did with Henry, because there's plenty of modern architecture that I love, although I never said so to Henry.
Having read Golden City, I can see why. There's an intense ferocity there that I would not want to cross in person either, I must say.
Ferocity is the right word. But the thing is that you have to approach these things with a very open mind, the kind of thing that, you don't read a book like that and say, "Oh, I disagree with him, this guy is an idiot." With somebody like Henry, if you had an open mind, you could learn a lot. You could learn a very great deal from Henry, who was quite simply one of the 2 or 3 most erudite men I ever met.
Fascinating. One question I have for you, Francis: would Henry Hope Reed, if he were alive in present times, would he have supported that proposed executive order that would have mandated classical architecture for the federal government's buildings?
Wow, what a can of worms. I think we can tell to some extent by the reaction of some of Henry's close friends and followers to that, quote, draft executive order, which was really just a publicity stunt from a group in Washington. The feeling among Henry's followers when that came out was one of utter horror. The notion that from this point forward, the cause of classical architecture was going to be associated with the Trump administration was like just almost was the thing that some of us, the only thing that some of us were thinking about until coronavirus hit. So I think Henry would have been uneasy with it in that sense. But I think then he also would have pointed out to you that Franklin Delano Roosevelt felt pretty much this way. You know, the Classical America, the organization that Henry co-founded in 1968, began something called the Arthur Ross Awards, which, named after the organization's great benefactor, Arthur Ross, that were given every year and that are now administered by the Institute of Classical Architecture, which absorbed Classical America. And one year, the Master of Ceremonies was Ambassador William Vanden Heuvel, who gave a little lecture prior to the bestowing of the awards, in which he talked about FDR and his commitment to classical architecture. So I think Henry would have been eager to divorce this issue from partisan politics,
Understood.
and certainly from Donald Trump.
Okay. Now, we do have a question from the audience that was essentially asking, what would Henry Hope's Reed's thoughts have been on a building like the Lever House? And I put it in the response in the comments already, but I wanted to hold up this page from the Golden City just because it is quite fascinating. On this side, you have a sort of loving description in full detail of all of the ornament and embellishment on the facade of this historic building. And then he contrasts it, and over here we have his entry on Lever House, which is simply no comment. So,
yes,
rather stark.
Yes. Henry didn't like stripped down modernist architecture. And may I just make one quick point, Brad? Henry's vision of classical architecture was also not always in line with the vision of classical architecture of many classicists.
Interesting.
Something that a lot of people don't realize is that Henry seriously disliked most of what was being done today in the name of classical architecture. And that's because Henry was devoted above all else to what we sometimes, in a weirdly dismissive way, call the arts of decoration. He believed that buildings should be embellished. His favorite word was embellished. That they should be ornamented. He loved the craftsmen of buildings. Henry was less interested in the architects, less interested in, let us say, Warren and Wetmore or Cass Gilbert than he was in the works of the artists and artisans who contributed to these buildings.
Right.
And very few people, arguably no other person, did more to discover or uncover the names of the artisans who worked on these buildings. And it was that was an extremely important thing. And it reminds us, again, if I just may very quickly say this, that Henry's formal training in this subject came at the École du Louvre in Paris. Henry was, incidentally, a Francophile who spoke French beautifully. And he studied under a very great scholar of French decorative arts named Pierre Verlet. If you know the field of the history of French decorative arts, Verlet's name is gigantic. And it's worth pointing out that Verlet was also a mentor, not just to Henry Hope Reed, but to Jane Wrightsman. And it was pretty much along Verlet principles that she developed the collections that are now the Wrightsman Galleries of French Decorative Arts, the Ancien Regime, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So Henry wasn't alone. And because of his deep study of French decorative arts, this was something that was of utmost importance to him, and his zeal to preserve these great buildings of New York's past was in particular a zeal to preserve the beautiful ornament and decoration of these buildings. Building like Lever House, that's not going to cut it in that context.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Francis. We are going to now switch over to some focus on Q&A here with the audience briefly. But before we do that, since this is in fact a coffee break chat, if you happen to have your coffee with you out there, I would just like to propose a coffee cheers, a coffee toast. So if you will, cheers. And all right, let's move on to some of these questions. So we have one from Debbie, and I know it's sort of a combination with another question out there, but basically, what would Henry Hope Reed think about? How would he react to this new format of virtual tours, of Zoom-based tours?
It's funny. I've been asked that question by about 10 people. Somehow people wonder about this, and as I said to someone just the other day, Henry, he would have adapted, but he would have needed some help on the technical side. But he would have adapted. He would have done it. That's the thing. If Henry were alive today, you'd be interviewing him on Zoom.
Very nice. One other question.
We lost you, Brad.
One other question is, was he active in advocacy at the Landmarks Commission once the Landmarks Law was passed in '65? Because he obviously was still very much active on the scene, but was he sort of formally engaged officially in advocating before the commission, for example?
Yes, and that was one of the purposes of Classical America, which was founded very shortly after the Landmarks Law was enacted. Classical America was a national organization, but it did, in fact, very strongly advocate for the preservation of certain buildings and provide testimony. I hope that answered the question.
Most definitely. And I'm looking to see, I don't see any other questions out there right now. Let's see here. Okay, it looks like we don't have any further questions, but I just wanted to reiterate our thanks, Francis, for all that you have done in sharing your personal insights. I think this has given us a much more holistic and fully colored view of Henry Hope Reed today, and his role in the preservation movement in the city, which is fantastic. I hope everyone will stay tuned. We do have some additional coffee break chats coming up. On May 6th, we will be talking with Patrick Chacon about the Brownstone Bible. And then on the 13th, we will have our very own board member, Anthony Robbins, talking about Margot Gale and cast iron architecture. So,
and if I may, very quickly,
yes,
Margot said that her interest in cast iron architecture came from a subject she knew nothing about, had never thought about until she went on a Henry Hope Reed walking tour.
Ah, very interesting.
Yeah, and I think there are very many people that could be that you could say that same thing about, including me.
Okay, well, actually, speaking of that, we do have a question. How did you first encounter Mr. Reed?
Henry actually encountered me, which is I wrote something that he liked, and he asked me if I would lead a tour for an organization that he put tours together for called Friends of the Parks. And now, although Friends of the Parks was focused on parks, this particular tour was of Lower Manhattan, and that's how I started doing tours. Henry uh, sort of roped me into it and sort of mentored me in how to do it. And my approach to them was very different from Henry. I am a little, how shall I say, I wave my arms a lot more than Henry does when I speak.
I
But
would have
uh,
pictured him as a gesticulator. I don't know.
Yeah, well, but I love that one photo. If you could, I don't know if you have it handy, Brad, but
Mhm.
that photo of Henry in Grand Army Plaza, Brooklyn,
Yes, let me
leading
pull
a
that up
tour.
one moment here.
This is Henry at his most raffish. Uh, the picture that you see behind Brad right now is Henry in Central Park. And um, yeah, I should mention, while Brad is trying to find that other photo, that Henry was named by Mayor Lindsay to a position that doesn't exist anymore, called curator of Central Park, uh, in which capacity he promoted the park, he advocated for the park, but he did so in such a way. There he is in Grand Army Plaza, Brooklyn. As I say, that is Henry at his most raffish. He's almost, he you don't see Henry looking that casual very often. Um, but he is telling people, this would be in the 1960s, telling people about the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch in Grand Army Plaza, Brooklyn. I can tell you exactly what he's saying about it. He's calling it one of the great works of art in America. And that was a view that not very many people had, a concept that very few people had in the 1960s. So you can imagine impact that that had on people. To be told that by somebody with an authoritative sounding voice was extremely powerful in a way that it's hard for us to be today. Uh, but uh, when it comes to Central Park, uh, Henry got into a lot of hot water. Um, when the Parks Commissioner, Thomas Hoving, allowed that Barbara Streisand concert to take place in the park, Henry was appalled. He went to the press and said so.
But
Anyway,
Francis, no one ever wants to make any changes in Central Park. I can't imagine what he would get bothered by.
uh, but the point that I wish to make is that Henry was very strongly an advocate of Calvert Vaux
Hmm.
as the principal author of Central Park. And I think that sort of the views that Henry expressed during the time he was curator of Central Park became the orthodoxy of the Central Park Conservancy. Not very often acknowledged, but I
Hmm.
think that he really strongly influenced the direction that park restoration and renovation would take beginning in 1980.
Right, because he's really the first major public figure who is bringing up this notion of we must adhere to or think about the original plan, because it had sort of become dormant as a concept at that point.
Yes, exactly. The original intention, I know you say original intentions,
Mhm.
it makes you think of Antonin Scalia, but but it's but yeah, he was hammering on that subject when no one else was.
Very interesting. Now, see, I know we have a few Jacob Ray Mold fans out there as well, so
Ah,
sometime we'll have to dig into the papers, the files, because I believe the bulk of Henry Hope Reed's papers are at Avery Architectural Library, correct, at Columbia?
they are indeed. In fact, among Henry's papers at Avery Library are his all of his meticulous walking tour notes,
Ah,
uh,
okay.
which I'm happy to say he uh, he made copies of and gave to me before he deposited those in Avery. So I have them too.
Okay, good to know. You know, we may also have to, as a result of this coffee break chat, speak with Urban Archive about recreating those walking tours on their digital platform.
That would be an interesting thing to do.
Hmm. And we have,
And
oh, go ahead.
and just do let me also very quickly point out that there's a brand new edition of the Golden City coming out uh, through the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, in addition with a foreword by the Philadelphia architect Alvin Holm, who was a very great friend of Henry's and one of Henry's favorite contemporary architects.
Okay. Now we have, I know we've run a bit long, but this has been quite fascinating, and there are so many strands to pull out from this figure. Two final questions here that have come in. One of them, do you know what Henry thought of the band shell? Now, when we hear the band shell, I presume this is in Central Park, and I presume this is the band shell that is currently there, not the earlier Jacob Ray Mold band pavilion or music pavilion that was taken down by the time Henry Hope Reed came along.
Well, the Naumburg band shell,
Right.
Henry didn't like the way that had all been done. The original design of that section of the park with the bandstand by Mold, the trees, the benches around the trees, was that was the sort of thing that Henry was trying to preserve in the park or to bring back to the park. So I don't know specifically, and I should know specifically what he thought of the Naumburg band shell, but I don't imagine that he thought that that was a good change.
Okay, okay. And then our final question, it's a very well-wrought question here, but I will have to distill it down a bit. Essentially, do you think that Reed's admiration for classical architecture was based on the particular time period within which he lived, and that sort of he, more than others, maybe was experiencing this wrenching change? Or was it because he simply loved that particular aesthetic and those architectural details? That itself was what drew him to it.
Well, I think that it goes maybe a little beyond that. I don't think that Henry would have called classicism a particular aesthetic.
Hmm.
I think that to Henry, it was, to use the words of great Sir John Summerson, classicism was the lingua franca of architecture in the West. It was a highly evolved language, like the English language, and that architects who dispensed with it were dispensing with basically the very thing that means by which architects had communicated to us for so long. To him, it was almost rejecting classicism was like rejecting evolution.
Very interesting.
Seriously.
Okay. All right. If there's anything else you wanted to conclude with, Francis, feel free. And it looks like we have addressed the questions.
I would only say that Henry could rub some people the wrong way, but what was remarkable in my experience of Henry over the years, and I knew him for a very long time, and I knew him very well, and I collaborated with him, is that even people who would read the things that he wrote and then throw the book across the room would, once they got to know Henry, kind of fall in love with Henry, because there was no one else really quite like him. And I think that people realized that even if I disagree with everything that Henry Hope Reed ever said or wrote, we still need Henry Hope Reed in our world. And for me, speaking both personally and in a more general sense, I just feel our world is kind of impoverished right now that Henry is with us no longer.
Thank you so much, Francis. And at this time, I'm actually going to unmute everyone, and you can show your appreciation for both our special guests, Otis and Nancy Pearsall, and our speaker, Francis Morrone. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you, everybody. It was good to see you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, Brad.
Bye. Thanks for coming.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
How do I get out?
Go very much. Lower
Okay,
right.
yeah.
Helen, are you trapped in the Zoom again?
Right. Stop doing this shit.
I'm trying.
Otis and
Yeah.
Nancy, can you
Yeah,
hear me?
yeah, absolutely.
Are you in Brooklyn Heights?
Of course.
Yes.
Oh, I thought maybe you were out in Eastern Long Island.
Perhaps we should be, but here we are,
All right.
tending to our architecture.
I recognize your beautiful living room.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye.